Hi, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of the most popular is our online lecture series. Those of you attending today represent many business sectors such as insurance, entertainment, technology, CPG, and more, as well as MSI members such as SC Johnson, Nike, Corteva, UPS, Walmart, Ford, and others. We're delighted to welcome you to learn more about authenticity and sponsorships. Now, before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Bettina Cornwell is the Judy and Hugh Oliphant Chair in Sports Business at the Lundquist College of Business at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on marketing communications and consumer behavior and often includes international and public policy emphases. Bettina's research has appeared in the Academy of Management Review, the Journal of Advertising, Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing, and other distinguished journals. And in 2016, she was named the Thomas C. Stewart Distinguished Professor at the Lundquist College of Business. She also serves as head of the marketing department. So we're very pleased to have Bettina with us today to tell us about fit and authenticity in sponsorship and other horizontal marketing partnerships. Bettina?
Thank you, Earl. It's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I'd like to have a shout out to all of the folks joining from other time zones, either getting up early or staying up late. As you mentioned, this is about fit and authenticity and sponsorship. I'd like to also say that this discussion applies to a lot of other horizontal marketing partnerships, to endorser relationships, to influencer marketing, even brand placement. So just to say, we'll talk mainly about sponsorship, but it is more generally applicable. So let's start with a little bit of background. And here's a classic example of sponsorship with the 49ers. And their stadium is sponsored by Levi Strauss. And Levi Strauss is paying about $11 million each year for 20 years with a 5-year potential extension for this relationship. So just to get us started with this topic of authenticity, can you imagine what might make this relationship authentic? I think even folks who are not in the US might say, well, they're both Bay Area icons. And so what we'll explore over the course of this discussion is a little bit about why this one works. So I'll start with a hint of background on sponsorship. I know there are folks from different areas joining, just a few slides there, and then we'll talk about a hint of history on fit, which is the construct that I think probably we need to think more about using fit or more about using authenticity instead of fit. And then we'll go into why sponsors and properties want authenticity, how you measure it, and what it gives you. So I think for this audience, I don't need to say the sponsorship has been growing and evolving. We don't have to have a conversation about esports here to say there are all kinds of new things happening. One of the reasons I love this area is because there's always something new to investigate. But let's look at popular IEG, International Event Group slides for a couple of seconds. They're out every year, and it shows the year-over-year growth. But this number on the end here, the 2018, $66 billion, that number is suggesting that sponsorship spending is large, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And I like to emphasize that sponsorship is usually leveraged or activated, and the most recent figures say that's a 2.2 to 1. So quick math, and we get 144 billion or so being spent in advertising in addition to the deals made. And I like to call that sponsorship is sort of the tail wagging the advertising dog. At any rate, we can also say from the IEG information that it's predominantly in sports. Now that said, there's been considerable growth in other areas of sponsorship, and although sports dominates, almost every program where you have a brand that has a large portfolio of sponsorships, you also see them also using charity or arts in some way in their portfolio. And that's important because I'm going to come to some points about sponsoring in those, especially charity, as being very particular. So again, a little bit of introduction. And to say that sponsorship has a lot of audiences, we're probably most familiar with the one along the top, consumers and awareness and image leading to sales. But to say that there are other important audiences and there are brands that are addressing those. Just a couple of examples. Chick-fil-A, they are very concerned with their channel members, and their Chick-fil-A sponsorship of the Peach Bowl is something that allows them to bring those individuals together and to support their franchisors. As another and different example, Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and Emirates Airlines have been very effective in communicating through sponsorship about the government level, national level reputation, and have been successful in developing what some people would call soft power through sport. Yet another example is Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and they've had a tremendous long-standing program of sponsorships in sport. They had NCAA, for example, where they're speaking to their consumer, but at the same time, they're very upfront about the fact they're also speaking to future employees. So a lot of audiences, and we'll cover some of those today. And just the shortest discussion on the history of fit, just so we lead into our discussion with a background understanding. And that is to say that sponsorship fit began really with celebrity endorser research and this idea of a matchup hypothesis. You may be familiar with this, but basically the idea was that there were some characteristics that an individual had, and you would assess them. The three that were popular were attractiveness, expertise, and trustworthiness. And the idea was that if your brand and this endorser matched along these dimensions, that probably it was a good choice. I think that the challenge with this, and something that was brought into sport and sponsorship measurement, is that you maybe haven't captured all of the important dimensions. For example, Rihanna was deemed just too sexy for this family brand. And I don't know their research and evaluation to make their decision on a celebrity endorser, but maybe they hadn't considered this. Now, taking the matchup idea into sport, immediately it was discussed that this might be a functional match, running shoe, running event, or it might be an image match. Photography is often popular at sports, so that might match well enough, right? And in the main, match, high match, was thought to be advantageous. I oftentimes argue that that is probably a dangerous space as well, because if you match as a brand perfectly with an event, so does your direct competitor. I don't know about the folks in the audience, do you run, do you cycle? But if you do, you may have been to an event, you may have participated, and you may have drank some liquid colored brightly, and then that evening could not say if that was Powerade or Gatorade. So point being, match can be valuable, but it may be also risky for confusion. On the other hand, for a long time, no match, low image, low functional congruence was viewed as not ideal. But I would argue, and we'll show you examples where that's not the case. Then we can say that this idea of matching evolved and expanded. And so it might be based in product or attitude geography, audience similarity, or relationship duration. And that last one leads us to the thought that these things evolve over time. So if I'm together longer, I fit better. But just one example of a measure of fit as our parting discussion, because fit has been the most utilized, without a doubt, construct in sponsorship for considering partners and deciding how you might join with a brand, or what the brand or sponsor and sponsee have in common. I'll just look at one of the items for the moment, and just to make the point that several years ago, many years ago, when this was first developed, the idea that it makes sense to me that this sponsor works with this sponsored property was probably a very useful item. And a bank would not be thought to go well with a marathon, maybe. But anymore, consumers, individuals, fans understand sponsorship well enough as a marketing platform that this is not a very discerning element. A lot of people would immediately think, of course, a bank is sponsoring a marathon as a communications platform. Okay, I bring this forward in measurement because we'll look at measurement of authenticity in just a few moments. Okay, so then what is fitting? Here's a European study, 3,000 fans, and what they find is that Emirates Airlines and Arsenal Football Club are the best fitting sponsorship relationship. Not so good were 10 of the least liked were the gambling companies. And we would say that gambling companies in sports betting would actually have some functional congruence here. In contrast, we have an airline from the United Arab Emirates and a team from the UK that don't have as much in common. However, they have been together a long time. And here we have a quote saying, well, it's really about brand values of the sponsor that reflect the brand values with the club. And that is a bit why I think we need to move closer to authenticity and understanding potential relationships. Okay, so why do sponsors want authenticity? I'm going to share with you a number of different research studies, both on the sponsor and the sponsee side. By the way, spell check, hate sponsee. I just want to put it out there for any of you that also suffer with that. We'll look through a number of different research studies, and this is my personal lead up to why authenticity is so important. So here is research with German colleagues, David and Christoph, and here we're looking at how a consumer fan infers the corporate motives of a sponsor by considering their deal characteristics. Now that's something you don't typically advertise to a fan, say, hey, wow, did you know we have a 30-year contract here? But they do receive and understand and become aware of this information. The question is, when they do, what kind of motive attributions do they make? So an example where it was tough going is Manchester United and Chevrolet. And when that deal was cut, it was financially, it was quite expensive. And in fact, the individual making the deal was subsequently fired. But that aside, there wasn't a lot of fan receptivity initially. So this kind of situation, what is that all about? So we asked ourselves, what deal characteristics, for example, contract length, the regional proximity of the sponsor to the sponsee, the fee, the type of sponsorship, what does that communicate about a sponsor's motives? So that Manchester United example, Chevrolet was seen as being what we might call calculative, in the sense there was a distant brand taking on the sponsorship. We've seen a lot more of that since that happened a few years ago. So not to say that it's not possible, but to say that we need to think about how we proceed and what we need to do in those situations. So we considered, do individuals view the relationship as affect, sort of attaching to the team, normative, we do this because we should, like we're headquartered here, we should sponsor this local team, or calculative in the sense we do this for our own self-interest. This was a large field study, nearly 3,000 consumers, 44 sponsorships in Bundesliga, so German soccer. And what we found were that, firstly, consumers definitely do assess corporate motives, and they look at the deal characteristics and infer the motives. And you find affective and normative motives support the brand and brand attitudes, and that stems from longer contracts with regional sponsors. But calculative motives hurt the brand, and those come from really high fees and, to a lesser extent, naming rights. We also ran a second study in this work where we looked at handball, and actually high fees can be a signal of supporting a sport if the sport is more fledgling. Okay, so why do properties want authenticity? Why does the sponsee want authenticity? Now, you can be on either side of this topic, that you believe that fast food and soda should be able to sponsor sport as a healthy activity, or you believe that fast food and soda should not be allowed to sponsor sport. No matter which side of that you fall on, you can definitely agree, though, that there's a hailstorm out there that a brand has to endure if they want to take a fast food or soft drink or confectionery product into the sports space. And the question is, on balance, does it end up being good for the brand to do this or not? My colleague, Ravi Papu, and I, we worked actually on a large-scale grant to try and answer this question for the nonprofit side. This was with the Blood Service of Australia. And in this grant, and we also used the Leukemia Foundation, we had this question that the nonprofits were a bit concerned about the solicitations by, for example, fast food. And so we developed some experiments to try and understand what was happening. And this is kind of an interesting, maybe even seemingly a little odd finding, but what you have is that high perceived similarity between alliance partners can be detrimental for poor fitting sponsorships. Here's how it works. We judge similarity even when we have aligned differences. We believe those as having a grounding in similarity. So, but when we have similarity along aligned differences, that can invoke skepticism. So, for example, I have a healthy sport and I have a food product that's believed to be relatively unhealthy and contribute to obesity. These items are aligned on a continuum of health, but people may judge one at one end and one at the other. And when that happens, there's a skepticism, a question if there's an ulterior motive for this relationship. greenwashing, pinkwashing, you've heard all of those terms. The same thing with the natural environment. Some activity related to the natural environment sponsored by a brand where their relationship to the natural environment is detrimental. So when you have these poor fitting sponsors, what happens is that they destroy the brand meaning clarity of the sponsored nonprofit. So I discussed this as the killing the goose that lays the golden egg, in the sense that if you want to align with something to change your image, if you destroy their image in the process, you both lose. So I usually counsel brands to choose a space that does not have an aligned difference. Here's another example of good intentions gone bad. Again, it is the perceptions that matter. We have MasterCard in a sponsorship activation, and they're offering meals to children for goals scored. Now, that seems reasonable at first, but the response from many audience members was rather different. So, well, just if you got the money, feed the starving children, right? And so they ended up having to, just provide money to children for food without connecting it to the sport activity. So again, we've got a challenging situation, and I usually tell brands, don't go for a quid pro quo, especially when it means you withhold something valuable from a needy group. That's not where you want to be. There are other ways to do this. And here, this is, again, with German colleagues, and Jan is a PhD student, and this came from his dissertation work. We said, well, okay, what if we give points for a relationship where you, as a consumer, a fan of the sports team, receive points, and then you get to choose to have this reward or not. And this was an experimental design, and these are three manipulations here: a financial reward, a symbolic reward, or social benefit reward. And our expectation that it was a financial reward was, sort of a bit more calculative than the others would be. And moreover, the whole concept of points awarded for purchases from the sponsor is a bit on the self-interested side for the sponsor. Nonetheless, actually, all three of these did well. Admittedly, the symbolic reward, social benefit were more altruistic, but what's really amazing is that this is symbolic award to have this a photo op with the team and then have that displayed, so affordable, right? Compared to something like even giving discounted tickets. So I think it's a matter of stepping back and thinking about what is an activation that makes sense and then wraps back around to the sponsored property. And this sort of relates to the gift-giving literature. And in that area, the idea is that our reward gives a cue regarding respect and compatibility. So I'm offering something that's symbolic or a social benefit to help local sport that comes back to the sponsored entity. Okay, now we can also have authenticity supporting overall goals from the perspective of internal audiences. So this is looking at employees of the sponsored organization and of the sponsor. So this is work with colleagues from the UK, and it's a bit more management oriented, but it supports marketing as well. So we draw on the organizational identification literature, well-established literature, many papers, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already. And we said to ourselves, well, we've got the employee and the employee organization, and identification works something like, if I'm identified, I would say we, And if I'm not very identified, I would say about my employee organization, they. So we add to this then the partner organization and ask ourselves, well, firstly, the evaluation of whether this is meaningful in organizational identification starts with the relevance that the individual might see for their own self-concept. So this is something that I appreciate, or I think we should do, or I like. I can see that this is meaningful. The other evaluation is the congruence between the organization and the partner. And that is to say, this may not be my cup of tea, but I can certainly say that this is good for my organization, or it works for my organization. Now, how does this play out in an individual employee's life? So this is the Nike headquarters just down the road. Beautiful, beautiful campus. And soon they're going to have the Serena Williams building. So Serena Williams is one of their athletes. They have a group of athletes that are endorsers, and they have buildings across the campus named for these athletes. Now you can imagine being an employee and going into the Serena Williams building every morning. And how does that make you feel? Do you feel sort of more that you identify with this organization, or that you don't identify as much? What about if you were working in the Tiger Woods Center on the Nike campus? How would that make you feel? Right, so the idea is that, like it or not, sponsorship is integrated with organizations, and it has a contributing potential in terms of organizational identification. Let's take another example. Here's Canadian mining company Teck. They do mineral development. They do focus on copper, zinc. They do steel making, energy. And they work with UNICEF to provide children with supplementary zinc. So you can imagine that you would feel good that your company is engaged in this way. Okay, now I don't want this next one to scare you, but we'll put all that together in a model for just a moment. Looking at that first column, just saying that any large company may have many, many sponsorship relationships, just thinking about focusing on one and thinking about it. That second column is really that relationship evaluation I just mentioned before. Is it relevant for me? Is it congruent with my organization? How do I think about those things? And that feeds into my identification process. So at the top there, that first light blue arrow, I might feel identity expression if my company now takes on a sponsorship that I didn't know we would do that. That's so me. That's so amazing. I feel that my identity is now expressed at my place of employment. You might have identity confirmation. Yeah, I knew we would do that. Or maybe they're sponsoring something that you didn't quite agree with. We did a number of case studies and report those. They make for interesting reading where folks just really didn't agree with what was sponsored next. And then those few instances where really there's identity violation, and it's quite distressing that this relationship now exists. And all of that is, that processing is considered with the opportunity for them to engage in this partnership, as well as the perceived authenticity. And then it results in the outcomes to identification. Okay, so one more set of examples to really finish this topic off, and that is Whirlpool Home Appliances and their relationship with Habitat for Humanity. And what they do in that partnership is Whirlpool provides the white goods, the range, the stove, the refrigerator, that go into Habitat for Humanity homes. And employees are involved in that process, and you can imagine that supports identification. In contrast, this is Buckets for the Cure, which was a relationship between Kentucky Fried Chicken and the Komen Foundation, which supports breast cancer research and sponsors races around the country and world. That didn't last long. Participants, all kinds of individuals, it was a hailstorm of criticism, in part because the consumption of fried foods and breast cancer is correlated. So inside, outside, there's so much potential for being authentic. Then how do we measure it? In our own quest, we looked at various measures that already existed, and we said, if we're going to measure relationship authenticity, let's see what we already have in terms of individual brand authenticity. And we picked up on Mohart et al.'s work. It's a very extensive study, and they came up with 4 dimensions. Continuity, I'm faithful to myself over time, credibility to, especially for the true to the customer, integrity in terms of caring and responsibility, and symbolism, an iconic brand, something like that, that's able to support the consumer in being true to themselves. And an example would, of course, be a Macintosh user, a Mac user is that expresses their brand feeling. So this is some research led by my PhD student, Erin, and we looked at 5 studies, different areas. So we used real and fictitious naming rights for stadiums, and we used co-branding and also celebrity endorser context to look at our new measure, where we took the brand measure and converted it to a relationship measure. We added some items, and we considered how we reworded it and everything. But across the 5 studies, we came up with a reliable and valid measure, and we can show how this scale predicts outcomes beyond that of fit. But most importantly, we showed that the multidimensional scale can be used diagnostically. And that's, I think, the value that we've been looking for. So here is on the left-hand side, our long scale. This is 16 items, 4 per dimension. And we also developed a short scale. And the brief scale works very well, very similarly to the long scale. However, the long scale offers you this ability to really look at the dimensions in a more meaningful way. And this diagnosticity, I think, is what we would like to be able to use when we're talking about judging whether we want to join in a partnership, but also how that partnership is doing over time. For example, if we take that San Francisco 49ers and the Levi's stadium relationship, and we use the outer red line, it has high continuity. These are both established brands, they're timeless, they have a sense of history, and that relationship would score very highly on continuity. It's also very credible, it has integrity, and it's very symbolic. So that outer dark red being San Francisco 49ers and the Levi's Strauss relationship. Now, the blue line, this would be something along the lines of the new relationship that we see with American Family Insurance and the Brewers, and they're taking over from the long-term relationship with Miller Park. So that stadium renaming, they cannot have the continuity, the timelessness that Miller Park had. And for many years, you probably won't see the kind of continuity measure you might like. But you can also say, as a brand manager on both sides of that story, I can't do so much about that. I can only work overtime to establish a new relationship. Now, they're regionally appropriate, they're based in the same region, and you have a lot of credibility, integrity, and a lot of other things going for it, but you can't have continuity right now, and that's okay. Again, judging whether I want to make this relationship, join in this relationship, but also using this measure to monitor over time how that's going. So what does authenticity give you? A few weeks ago, I was in Copenhagen and had the opportunity to meet with folks at Novo Nordisk, and they are a large Danish multinational pharmaceutical company most known for their insulin therapies. And they sponsor pro cycling. You might say, hey, Bettina, how authentic is that? It's almost a little dangerous, isn't it? You've got a pharmaceutical company in the middle of pro cycling discussions about drugs. Is that really where you want to be? And the answer is yes, because this cycling team, every member has diabetes. And every time that they talk about drugs and therapeutic drug use, right, they come up on the right side of it. They must have insulin to live. And so this is a careful thought about what we might sponsor and how we can make this sponsorship relationship authentic. And so that's sort of leads to my final paper. All right. In an advertising journal, I tell them that we probably need to think of sponsorship less as advertising and more as sponsorship-linked marketing and authentic engagement. And I think that the billboards out there, the logo out there, yes, it does serve that function of awareness, but we can do probably more, as we just saw with that pro cycling sponsorship. And pulling out a model from that paper. The idea is I have sponsorship engagement that's based both on my brand and the relationship authenticity. So I look at my sponsor or my property characteristics. I look at my sponsor characteristic and I ask what links based on both the brand authenticity and the relation authenticity can I develop? And that's where you come up with a cycling team where all members are diabetic. So that idea is to have authentic engagement enacted both in the partnering selection, can we go together, but also in the leveraging and activation that takes place. And my argument here is that all of this contributes to the basic outcomes that have already been established in the literature. So I can already contribute to awareness and to liking and to purchase, but I can also contribute to engagement outcomes. Here we have brand loyalty, brand attachment, even brand love. I can build more with sponsorship if I think of it as authentic engagement than I can if I just think of it as advertising. Okay, as I say, that's all my materials, and I'm happy to directly send you any of these papers if you'd like them, and I think we're open for questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Bettina. That was great. And there was a question that came in actually via email right before we began, which I want to pass on and get your reaction, and then some additional issues that have come up. The question was from Johan, with live streaming increasingly a way that people consume media, would any of your findings or conclusions be different? Or what would your thought be about the opportunities for brands to demonstrate authenticity when they're live streaming events? Presumably it has sort of the flavor of, in the moment, it's authentic in that regard, but I just wonder if maybe the medium through which consumers experience these brand sponsorships might itself make a difference.
I totally agree with that comment. I do think there are amazing opportunities with live streaming. Some brands set up a headquarters for live events such as the Olympics or others, and they're constantly monitoring social media and what they put out as a message, but also when consumers or fans pick up and utilize that message, bend and twist it in a direction, and then they amplify those organic commentary pieces by other individuals. And I think it's a great opportunity. The good news is it's also particular, and you can be very targeted. And it's also broad and reaches a large audience in the broadcasting.
That's interesting. I think it connects very nicely with your closing comment there about the opportunities to create engagement outcomes. And I was going to ask the question about, do you need a sort of feedback mechanism where the fans can participate, not just receive these messages and evaluate them, but actually participate in the activity in some way? And I think that's what you're describing as one of the opportunities you have with live streaming events and social media commentary, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. It's interesting. You can have the opportunity for individuals to participate, but in a way, not everyone needs to participate per se, but they can just know that there is an opportunity to participate and you feel closer to that brand. Moreover, you don't have to be the one to participate. You can see others participating, know you can, and feel that two-way connection.
That's interesting. We've actually seen some research, I'm sure you're familiar with some of this, about how experiences change from consumers since that it is a shared experience at a sporting event or elsewhere. And interestingly enough, with sort of 24/7 online mobile access these days, if you choose to be, you're almost always with someone else, either virtually or physically. And so that sense of the shared experience probably is more important to consumers today than ever before. I want to remind the audience that you can post questions during this period by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have additional questions or comments you want to share with us, we'll take those into consideration. In the meantime, I want to come back to the example you gave towards the end of the different reactions of the Whirlpool donating appliances to Habitat and Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, food donations and sponsoring something like breast cancer awareness. There seems to be an obvious disconnect in the second example, as you pointed out. But I'm wondering more broadly your thoughts about the difference between a brand or an organization providing financial support for some worthy cause versus engaging its employees in some kind of activity. In other words, instead of donations of money, more like donations in kind or donations of whatever area of expertise the organization has. I've seen from my own experience in the past that sometimes the employee engagement activities are more credible and palatable to consumers than just cutting a check. I'm wondering to maybe elaborate on your thoughts about that.
I think that's very true because the employee is more seems more accessible, and when you have individuals there, it certainly makes a difference for the sponsored entity, the individuals. For example, a lot of sport relationships, you'll have tickets that are part of the value, and when the employees don't show up and there are empty seats in the stands, that makes the whole game harder, right? But when people do show up and they are engaged and employees are the face of the company, it can be really powerful. I lived in Australia for a while, and one of the sponsorship relationships that I enjoyed was one where Queensland Rail was related to the local Australian rules football, or not, that's rugby. And they would come out, and employees would spontaneously do these music programs of Indigenous music and different sorts of things. Really inspiring, and you just felt so much closer to that relationship because the employees were out doing that sort of before the event impromptu. It was really lovely. So no, I totally agree. I also believe that the in-kind part of that donation of white goods to Habitat for Humanity is also a demonstration of their confidence in their product. They're putting their product into these homes and people are using them. And that says, we believe in our product. So it's product demonstration and confidence there. So in-kind can be really valuable. Admittedly, many organizations on the sponsee side would like you to cut a check. But the way to do that is to do a bit of both.
That's a good point. And I'm glad you made the point about kind of the confidence you have in your product or your service. It would be important, I would imagine, though, to walk that fine line and not seem to be too self-serving, like, you know, getting your appliances out there as an aspect of your marketing. Frankly, it probably does help in that regard, but that shouldn't be the primary takeaway, I think, in a situation like that.
Yeah, they're given away and they're very much appreciated. So I think they're walking that line beautifully. Yeah.
One of the questions that just came in was to what extent competitors can influence perceptions of your the authenticity fit in your brand sponsorships and things. And I think, in my mind at least, that's related to the point you made earlier about, you know, there's an obvious functional connection between running shoes and a running event. But that's true of anybody who puts the shoes out, whether it's Adidas or Nike or other shoe makers, so you don't get the differentiation and maybe even lead to confusion. Mm-hmm. But just more generally, kind of your sense of the competitive response to sponsorships and to what extent you need to take into account how the competitors may try to frame this.
Yeah. Well, especially when you have ambushing and the ambushing extends to, you know, on location to pop-up retail and different sorts of things like that, it can be very confusing. So the sponsoring brand needs to isolate a communication aspect that they will focus on with some adherence to that communication aspect throughout the sponsorship engagement, and to not waver from it. And it needs to be something. Do you remember those old unique selling propositions, right?
Right.
Has to be
some of that still works, right?
Yeah, some of those things were genuine and they still work. It has to be something that the competitors can't claim, and that you're able to really deliver that unique aspect, or it's hard to rise above the competitive attack if it is there, especially in the on-site. But we also see, and we've done some research, and I could share that if anybody's interested, on sort of advertising and sort of a arm's length ambushing that happens. And there, again, you also have the vulnerability of being confused with your major competitor in the same space in, say, a publication or an online promotion or something like that. So it's everywhere. And that is all the more reason for adhering to a main story and being authentic, and admittedly somewhat repetitive.
No, yeah, and actually that raises a question. Maybe you have a thought about this. We use the terms like ambush and hijack and so forth to describe that activity, which have negative connotations. Is that a viable strategy for a brand to sort of attempt to intrude itself into another brand sponsorship relationship, or to get credit for something? I know this came up in the last Super Bowl. I guess there was some brand hijacking going on. Or is that almost inherently a negative thing, and is it seen that way by consumers? Do they sort of resent the attempt of another brand to intrude in that situation?
No, Earl, that's a great question, because when we do studies of ambushing, people say, oh, that's naughty. I don't agree with that. But when somebody ambushes and it's hilarious, or it gives you a free product, or it made your life easier, they don't sit back and say, "Oh, that was miserable. Oughtn't do that." So, I would say that ambushing, like it or not, whichever side you're on, it can be very effective, it, as long as you don't, they drew a line in the sand with the law regarding ambushing in events, right? But as long as you walk up to the line gingerly and don't step over it, it's another way in which marketing is accomplished.
That's a great insight, I think, about the element of humor kind of diffusing what could otherwise be a negative. You used a term a moment ago about not wavering or maintaining authenticity, and that raised a question I wanted to bring up earlier. Celebrity endorsements, that was, as you said, one of the original notions about sponsorship and the notion of the fit with a celebrity. That has some risk, and you cited an example in passing, Nike and Tiger Woods a few years back. There was some controversy around that relationship, but my understanding is that Nike stayed with Woods as a sponsor through that period and got some credit for doing so, and was actually reflected in sales of some of their products that he was endorsing, golf balls and things. So I'm just wondering, generally, your thoughts about the risk of the celebrity endorsement, because you never know what your celebrity is going to do. On the other hand, the value of standing by that celebrity and not just sort of bailing the first time there's some controversy.
Yeah. I think the line that was drawn there was, is there a violation of this person's authenticity in the sport? Have they taken drugs? Have they cheated? Have they deflated a football? Have they done something naughty? And then that says, I shouldn't be aligned with this individual. Now, in their personal life, not related to this aspect of whatever it is they're doing for their profession, they might also do something that is so bad that you say, that character, that ethic, I don't believe that I should stay with this endorser. So the first cut is certainly, is it violating their contract in terms of, and personal contract, ethical contract even, in terms of what they do in competition, in sport, or in terms of art or music? And then the additional question is, as a human, is this too far? And if you use both of those, I think you make relatively good decisions about whether to go forward or not.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, and that's something certainly to keep in mind. I think too often you see situations where there's a controversy and the celebrity is suddenly cast aside or whatever, and it makes you wonder about the commitment at the beginning, if it really was just a marriage of convenience, if you will, or if that really was shared values or something. I think a related issue you touched on towards the end is interesting, and that is the notion of kind of transferring these things. I think you mentioned American Family Insurance taking over the naming rights for Miller Park. We have our own example of that here in Boston. There's a large high-rise office building that we still call the Hancock Building years after it was sold by John Hancock to another entity. Or you talk about the Sears Tower in Chicago, and it hasn't been Sears for at least a decade. So are there some, again, challenges or problems with sort of trying to transfer that relationship or ownership? Are there advantages of starting clean? You mentioned before that financial support for a fledgling sport might be more acceptable. So just your thoughts about, would it be better for a brand to look for new opportunities, or is it worth it to maybe assume the opportunities for a more famous site that had previous sponsorship?
Yeah, there's several ways to approach that. Firstly, yes, new stadiums without a previous name, they command more money because the history isn't something they have to deal with. There are a couple of papers out there. We have one in the Journal of Advertising. There's another in European Journal of Marketing. And those two papers basically investigate this carryover effect, that if you are taking over from an existing sponsor, and then that sponsor is going to have that sponsorship probably at least for the first year, unless you just do something in terms of activation that is very profound. And the interesting one that we did, we looked at the sponsorship at the time of the sponsorship, as well as 6 months later away from that. And we can show there that when you get out of the limelight, that people remember the old sponsor again. And so that carryover effect, that continued relationship is definitely taking brand value from the new sponsor. That said, when you leave a sponsorship relationship, there are interesting ways to utilize that phenomena, and that is to, for example, exit a large, expensive sponsorship relationship in terms of title sponsorship, and maybe move down a notch, continue a relationship, and you'll be remembered for many years without paying as much money. So there are lots of ways to positively utilize that phenomena of the carrying over. But it is real, and it's probably the most dangerous when you have a brand that takes over from their direct competitor. And there you have confusion as well as the carryover.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, because it illustrates the reality, as you put it just now, of this phenomenon and the strength of these branding associations that you can build up over time, which I think is one answer to, is it worth it? Is this something we should do or consider doing? So I think you've given us some great guidelines on how to think about the issue and when and where to apply this. I want to remind the audience that we will be sending out a recording of the webinar soon after this, and if you have additional questions, you can follow up with Bettina at tbc@uoregon.edu. As she indicated, she'd be happy to hear from you and share her research papers. And I want to remind the audience that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. Thanks again to Bettina and our audience, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next lunch lecture.
Thank you, Earl.